right, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Today we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 10. There is a good chance that we may be looking at it next week too, because I have 17 slides, and I normally have 8. So, about midway through, I have a slide that says, "Are you ready for a break?" And if you are, we'll discuss it then, and then we'll pick up next week. But if you want to plow through it to the end, then we'll pick up there. So, let's get started here on Hebrews chapter 10. Maybe if I talk fast, then we can get through all of it, right? So we've looked at Christ being the better way, the better hope, the better priest, the better sanctuary for us. And now, today, we have looked at, especially, Christ being the better sacrifice for that better covenant. Just sit up there. Thank you, sir. And so we've laid all the groundwork for what the Hebrew Scripture, how Jesus fulfills the Hebrew Scriptures. And now we're going to explore in chapter 10 here, especially in the second half of the chapter. I'm really only going to look at the second half of the chapter today. What is probably one of the strongest, one of the stiffest, and most challenging warnings in the book of Hebrews, if not all of the New Testament. And so, let's just go right for it, right? Several questions are going to come to mind when we think about this. Maybe, why does this author get so intense here? Why does this author really want the people of the early church to examine their motives for following Jesus and examine their hearts as to whether or not they're actually loyal to him and showing faith towards him? Why does he say this is so important? What's going on with these sorts of challenges? Remember, we said there's challenges previously, and the challenges in the book of Hebrew that the author is making to you, he's making a challenge to you, are not designed to scare you. They are designed, though, to make you feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. Feeling uncomfortable is okay. That's not a popular thing. Remember, we talked about Bible class, how we as Americans have a pill for everything. We don't like suffering, right? We have one of the most advanced medical systems in the world because we don't like suffering. And so I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what I am saying is that suffering is a part of life. And so now there's some news. And we call it good news, right? And if the gospel of Jesus, this gospel message, is good news, and it's good news of God's grace, shouldn't that be good news for us? Why is there a challenge here then? Why is it that there has to be this sort of intimidating or really intense, what some people might even call bad news? Why does that have to go along with that message? And the answer is because the stakes are high and there's real risk involved with following Jesus. And as I was going through preparing this lesson, I found myself really deeply challenged myself. But I also found myself with a renewed sense of God's grace and covenant promises for me. And covenant promises that he's made for our entire broken world. And so I hope that's something that you can discover too this morning as we look at Hebrews chapter 10. So today in Hebrews chapter 10 is an important sort of transition in the big picture of the book. If you have that paper that I handed out to everyone, you'll notice that Hebrews chapter 10 is all the way on the right. And there's only one more big section of the book, and it's down below on the bottom, where we talk about the different heroes of faith and different things. And so today, Hebrews chapter 10 is a very important transition. We're looking at the last half of chapter 10, and it's going to start in verse 19 and go to the end of the chapter. And that section of Hebrews is like a big swinging door. The first 9 chapters are like a big swinging door, and Hebrews chapter 10 is the hinge. And for the last 9 weeks, the author has introduced us to this whole area, exploring the character and the ministry of Jesus as a priest, Jesus as our high priest, right? Jesus as the sacrifice of that high priest, Jesus as that sacrificial lamb, right? And so Jesus as the one who goes into the holy place and inaugurates a new covenant. It's priestly stuff that's going on here, and Jesus is that high priest person that's fulfilling that role. And he's going to bring to a close in the text that we're at today. In the first half of chapter 10, he's trying to say, if Jesus has done this, if he's our priest, if he's our stand-in for us, if he's the one who comes to do for us what we can't do for ourselves because we're too broken, we're too compromised as human beings, we're too compromised to get ourselves out of the mess that we've got ourselves into, right? Because we've become too broken. If he's done those things, he's offering a new way. Together with God and before God, if Jesus, in fact, is the priest and the offering, he's the one who can make the offering, and he is the offering himself in his death, and he's going to absorb all the evil and all the sin and the death here into God's presence, so that we can hold fast to the story of God and how he's redeemed and rescued our world, and to those who have turned to him in faith. You need to hold on to it, because that's what keeping your faith means in this story, right? It's growing in the knowledge and the understanding of the story of God and that's found in the scriptures. That's what's going to constantly remind me and help me draw near to God personally. And that's hard for a lot of reasons, right, in our lives. I mean, particularly, the gospel is strange, right? Kind of like putting cow pus on a cut in your arm is strange, right? It's pretty strange. I don't know if this has ever struck you, especially, I don't know if this ever struck you recently, but this is a Jewish prophet 2,000 years ago. He claims to be the Messiah. He claims to be the Son of God, but yet he addresses God as Father, right? And he claims to be one with God. And he claims actually to be the Creator God who has become human, and then he's executed by Romans, and this is somehow a good thing that has everything to do with everybody who has ever lived. Come on. That's not a story that is common, right? That's something that's different, that's weird. It's not intuitive. It's counterintuitive, right? I never would have thought it would have worked out that way. It's as counterintuitive as saying that you need to inject this cow disease into your body to get better. It doesn't make any sense at all, but that's the truth, and sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, right? And so holding fast to that confession of the gospel, this is the surprising story of God's grace and how he accomplished redemption in our world. And you have to hold on to it. It's the means by which that we draw near to God and go into his presence. And it's how we grow in our knowledge and our understanding of the gospel. It's by holding on to him, by giving our confession, by putting our allegiance in him. Growing in our knowledge and understanding of the gospel helps us understand that this is not just myths and fairy tales. These are real events that happened in real places, in real times in the world. These are verifiable events that there's evidence for. And these events have a cosmic significance, not just in a little strip of land that's 200 miles wide in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is cosmic, outside of even the world significance. And he says, hold on to it. Hold on to that message. That's the proper response. What Jesus has done for us, hold on to it. Draw near to him. Hold fast to him. That's the proper response. And it's bound up with the third response that he has here in verse 24. He says, and let us watch out for one another to provoke love and good works, not neglecting to gather together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, all the more as you see the day approaching. And so we intentionally meet together, right? And we meet together to consider how we can provoke one another, right? With sticks, we provoke each other. Provoke is a negative connotation in modern English, but it just means to prod on to something, not just always on to anger. Like we stop provoking your brother, type of language that we use a lot. So we intentionally meet together to provoke each other, to stir each other up, to live out our allegiance to Jesus, the Christ. Remember, Christ is not his last name. Christ means Messiah. And so we need spaces, and we need times, and we need rhythms in our life where we can come together as a family, because there's a million other stories out there of how to make things right in the world. And there's a million other gurus out there that are willing to tell you how to make your life better if you cut them a check, right? And the gospel message is in competition with all those. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's not. And so we need to prioritize the coming together in our own lives with other people who are sharing in this story with us. And this confession of our hope and allowing that message to challenge us, challenge how we live, challenge how we behave, and challenge the very choices that we make. That's what that's what the writer of Hebrews is getting at here. We don't exactly know who. A lot of people think it was Paul. And so what is the proper response to who Jesus is and what Jesus has done? Here are these ways that you hold on to him. You draw near to God by the personal practice of coming into the presence of the living God. Anytime, any place, the curtains are open because of Jesus, we can come into the presence of God. And so I would say that we firmly believe that the New Testament is very clear, right? There's no free agents in the kingdom. This is not, the NFL, where you can go and do your own thing if you want. Right? To be someone who's drawing near and holding fast is to be somebody who is vitally plugged in to the local community of believers. It's about engaging intentionally with one another. It's not just like hanging out with friends who are also Christians. That's a good thing, to hang out with friends who believe. But do you see anything random here in verse 24 in his response? This is about intentionally coming together for the purpose of lifting each other up, of worshiping together. And so, like the story of Edward Jenner, the story opens up in tragedy. Right? The remedy has been researched, it's been accomplished, he's found it, it's been made public. But there are some, right? There's always some who mock and who reject and who don't respond positively to the remedy. He calls them to respond, but it's not always our natural tendency to respond, right? Because I want what I want. That's the very problem Adam and Eve had, right? See that tree? It can be yours. That power can be yours. And so there will be some who don't respond, who might even antagonize against the remedy, against the cure. And so he doesn't pull any punches, starting in verse 26. He doesn't pull any punches. He just moves right towards people in verses 26 and 27. And most of us are going to like the first part of the chapter better. Let me read verses 26 and 27. For if we deliberately go on sinning after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire about to consume the excuse me. The fury of a fire about to consume the adversaries. Go sit down. Go sit down. Yeah, it's pretty intense, isn't it? So what's happening here? Well, he's obviously moved on to some very strong warning language, right? And unfortunately, throughout the history of the church, these verses have been terribly misunderstood. There's lots of different ways this has been interpreted. A great many of them are very poor, though. And so if you were just to take what we just read, verse 26 and 27, if you're just to pluck them out and put them on a page and give somebody that page and say, this is the New Testament, that wouldn't be very good news, would it? And you'd read that and you say, okay, well, I guess I've come to a knowledge of the truth, but if I sin deliberately, Jesus is done with me. I'm toast, right? Fiery furnace, toast. It's supposed to be a joke. Anyway. I mean, tell me I'm wrong, right? If we just had these two verses, that's what they seem to say, but we don't have these two verses. We have a whole Bible. We have the whole of chapter 10 especially to tell us what these verses mean. And so right off the top of our head, we should immediately, when we hear this phrase, sinning deliberately, we need to think, what examples of sinning deliberately do we have? Sinning deliberately. Well, the idea of what he's bringing up for the rest of this chapter is found in Numbers chapter 15. Let me just turn there real quick. Because the same language is used in Numbers chapter 15. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers chapter 15. And somewhere towards the end. 27. If a person sins unintentionally, he is to present a year-old female goat as a sin offering. The priest will then make atonement before the Lord on behalf of the person who acts in error, sinning unintentionally. And when he makes atonement for him, he will be forgiven. You are to have the same law for a person who acts in error, whether he is an Israelite or an alien, if he resides among you. Pretty simple, right? If you mess up, there's a sacrifice. The language here that he's using is from this key passage there in Numbers 15, from the Torah of Moses, from the law of Moses. And this is about intentional and unintentional, about intentional or deliberate sin. Let's say somebody breaks command number 473, right? Because they had about 613. But they didn't realize it, right? Is there a means for forgiveness for them? Yes, right? Animal sacrifice provides that atonement, which means covering of sin, atonement, at-one-ment, covers the sin. The animal, in its death, covers over my offense. This animal, something dies in my place, and I receive forgiveness, right? That's grace is shown to me. It's good news, actually. This unintentional sin is covered over. But anyone who sins defiantly, right? Let's keep going back. Let's go back to Numbers. Numbers chapter 15. Let's going to keep going there. Numbers chapter 15, let's read verse 30 through 31. But the person who acts with a high hand, that's the literal translation. anybody have anything else there for verse 30? Numbers chapter 15, verse 30. But the person who acts how? That's later in the verse. Defiantly. Yeah, defiantly. So this is an idiomatic phrase. It's a picture of a person who's going like this, about to hit something. Right? The person who acts like that, whether he's a native or a resident alien, blasphemes the Lord. This person should be cut off from the people. He will certainly be cut off because he has despised Yahweh's word and broken his command. His guilt remains with him. Sins defiantly. That literal translation of that is with a raised fist or with a raised hand. They have to be surely cut off. Their guilt remains with them. Okay? How are we doing when we hear that? How do we feel about that? That's pretty tough, right? Pretty stringent, pretty rigorous. For somebody who doesn't want forgiveness, what means of forgiveness is available to them? For someone who doesn't want the remedy, doesn't want the cure, the very thing that's designed to help them, to save them, if that is the very thing that they reject, what's left for them? Now, you might look at this and say, okay, well, anyone who sins deliberately or intentionally, and you're thinking about maybe your own life, right? I've done lots of things bad intentionally. Yeah, that's like most of the sin that we do in our life, right? We know it's bad. And then you feel guilt. You feel remorse. You're confronted. And if we humble ourselves and we make it right with the person that we've wronged, then there is a sacrifice available for us. But for the defiant person, what sacrifice is there for them? And look what he's going to do right here. In Hebrews chapter 10, he says in verse 28, anyone who disregarded the law of Moses died without mercy, based on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Wow. Numbers 15, there it is. You saw it, right? We read it here together. The law of Moses was established on sacrifice of animals. They died without mercy. Verse 29. How much worse punishment do you think one will receive who has trampled on the Son of God, who has regarded as profane the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and who has insulted the Spirit of grace? So how much worse is the punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has spurned, who has rejected the Son of God? Some translators might have trampled on, right? I think that's one of the main translations of this. Trampled on the Son of God. That's literally what the word used here means. It means stepping on intentionally, like stomping, trampling on the Son of God. You see, grace is the very thing that God is trying to give us. But for somebody who doesn't want grace, what's left? And that's what he's getting at here. For someone who is not just indifferent to Jesus, but someone who is opposed, what's the remedy? Well, if they don't want the remedy, there's nothing remaining for them. There's no sacrifice for sins left for them. And so many people have read these verses in this chapter and they begin to worry and they begin to get super scared for themselves. Let me tell you right now, if you feel scared, you are not on this list. That's not what's going on here. Right? Just because you think you have sinned deliberately, and you probably did, that's just not what the author is referring to here. The author is not referring to the journey of following Jesus that involves fallible people like us, right? This is the part of the journey we're in. Sometimes we mess up. I try to follow Jesus, right? It's difficult, right? It's hard. It's hard. Amen? right? I'm going to fail. But that is the point of the cross. That my failures don't bury me. I bury the failures. My failures were buried with Christ. And I was raised a new creature from the dead without my failures. My sins aren't raised from the dead. I am raised from the dead. So let's read verse 31. It's a terrible thing to fall in the hands of the living God. I thought things were going to get better, but they didn't. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And we need to talk about this because this is one of the fundamental questions that people have. And this is one of the places in the Bible it is close to being answered, closest to being answered. And that is, why does a good God allow bad things to happen? And the answer is, he doesn't. He says it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the Lord. It's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And that's difficult. That's not an easy thing to say. Right? You know, I can't sugarcoat this, what's going on here. It just is. We have to sit in these very challenging verses and listen to them. These very stern words to us. We don't like to hear those sorts of words, right? The language of judgment, of fiery judgment. I think it's difficult for many of us to swallow those words because we're taught we're never supposed to judge. But here we have judgment. It's very important to focus on the language here of the Bible. The language of judgment in the Bible is ultimately always, in the Bible, always for a positive reason. You think, well, how is destroying people positive? Well, let's talk about that. The language of God's wrath and God's anger, it's always rooted in something deeper. And this is the answer to the age-old riddle of how could there be bad things and God still exist? You see, in the Bible, God's wrath and his judgment is rooted in his goodness and his love. Okay, Joel, you still haven't answered the question. How is judgment go along with love? Right? That sounds as strange as having cow disease injected in you to get a cure. That's a strange. But that is exactly what the scriptures are trying to get us to see, because justice is what is making things right in this world. Justice is making things right. And justice is the good and loving response when something goes wrong. If I ride my bike, if I'm riding my bike, right, and I'm riding by Keat, and I see a bunch of fifth graders kicking a second grader in the stomach during lunch or whatever, and I kind of think to myself, yeah, whatever, you know, kids being kids. Am I loving or am I good? No. That is, I am not loving and I am not good if I do not enact justice. If I don't get angry, if I don't say something to somebody, am I loving? Am I good? If I don't say anything? So we can see here, love and goodness go together. And they intervene in situations of evil and injustice to make them right. And that's always what's behind that language of God's wrath and his judgment here in the Bible. So let's look at, well, we don't have time for that. I'm watching the clock. Let's skip that. Let's look at how things go in human history in our communities here, right? It's bad, right? Is God loving or good? Is he loving or good if he just says, oh, humans are humans, they're going to kill each other? We know that's not loving. We know that's not good. And so there's this core conviction of Christians. And before that, there was the Jewish worldview, is that there's coming a day when God will set things right. And there will be good news for some. That'll be good news for some. And it will be bad news for others. And the good, the paradoxical, the unintuitive good news of the gospel is that God's justice was taken out on his son for us so that we get access to that remedy, right? Jesus takes that hit for us. That's the surprising, counterintuitive remedy of the gospel. And it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. In fact, most of us, and most of the people in our culture, right? We can't even get past the fact that I'm being called on the carpet and being named as someone who is broken, who is selfish, who is helpless, who is compromised morally. It makes us angry when we hear those things. What are you saying about me? I would, if that's your response, I can understand that. But I would encourage you to carefully consider whether or not you're acting like that anti-vaccine society. If you're not acting and reacting against the very thing that can save you. The only thing that can save you. So how do you end up becoming defiant and shaking your fist at God? You end up on that route through a slow process, a slow trajectory where you stop holding fast to the confession. I begin to lose my grip on the gospel. I've stopped constantly thinking about the gospel in my life. Every day I stopped drawing near. I gave up on those rhythms of meeting together with other Christians on Sunday or for a Bible study. I stopped gathering together. I stopped intentionally being led into relationships with other believers where we come together and challenge each other. And so these warning passages, again, are not there to make us afraid, but they are there to make us uncomfortable, and that's okay. The warnings here in Hebrews chapter 10 show us the ultimate picture, that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy and grace. And I think that speaks a very powerful, clear word to us today, that this idea that if I'm actually morally sick and diseased, and I'm morally sick and diseased more than I think I am, and what's the remedy? That remedy is confronting us. It's right in front of us. It's the gospel message. It might confront me, and maybe it's actually counterintuitive to what I think it would look like. It's that counterintuitive challenge of the good news about our high priest and about the sacrifice that he's made for us. And the question is, how will we respond? Will you prioritize the coming together with other people around that story of Jesus in worship together like we are this morning? Will you hold on to that confession of your hope? Will you allow it to challenge you, to challenge the way you live, how you behave, and the choices that you make? That all begins when you first confess Jesus as Lord. When you repent of your sins, you tell everybody, hey, I'm going a different direction, and you decide that you want your sins washed away in baptism. Then, and only then, you can be clothed with Christ, Paul says in Galatians chapter 3. Those old sins and evil things are buried, and you come up out of the water a new person. If you haven't made that commitment, I encourage you to make that commitment today. Next week, we'll look at Hebrews chapter 11. Thanks for sticking with me, even though it was sort of a long lesson today. Have a good morning, everyone. Uh-oh.